Hey, welcome back to another episode of Detection at Scale. Today, I am here with Chris Witter, who is an engineering manager for detection and response at Spotify. Chris, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you.
Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I'm Christopher Witter. I go by Witter. Been doing cybersecurity, I'll say long enough to see it change names a few times. When I started out, it was information assurance. Then it was information security. Now it's cybersecurity. So that kind of dates it like a little bit. I started doing nation state investigations before it was commercially popular, right? I started off working for a defense contractor, was one of their founding members for their CSIRT team. I've worked on a CSIRT team at a global bank. I was one of the founding members of the Falcon Overwatch Team at Crowdstrike. That was probably one of the most biggest defining moments. I've worked for a couple of MSSPs. And today I lead the detection and response teams for both cloud and enterprise at Spotify.
It's quite a resume. I'm really interested in all of it. Let's lean a little bit into CrowdStrike, just given, their massive growth in the last, call it 10 years, right? Going from a specific endpoint agent to now becoming this massive company. Tell us a little bit about Overwatch and what it is and what your experience was with it.
I started at CrowdStrike actually before we had a official product. It was just a services team and they were building it. So that was kind of an interesting ride. I was in the first 100 or so people and wrote it out to about 12 or 1,500 people. But Overwatch was one of those things where, we had such good observability of what was taking place and the technology was so new. It required a little bit of customer education. A lot of the things you would traditionally get would be from traditional forensics, right? You'd be like, oh, I want this. I want to know what commands they run. Oh, you got to do memory forensics for that. Oh, I want to know what was on disk. Oh, you got to do disk forensics for that. What files are written. Now, all of a sudden, you were putting all this at your fingertips within seconds. It created an entirely different scenario where traditional incident response would take, weeks, days, sometimes months, depending on how long and far it went. We could do those investigations and kind of wrap it up with a nice little bow in 15 minutes, with a couple of queries and just following the trail of breadcrumbs. We were there originally first for end user education, customers. Hey, look at all the cool stuff we could do. And that slowly and methodically built into, oh, well, this is actually an extreme value. People would pay for this because not only as a vendor, a lot of organizations be like, oh, I'll pay for somebody to do that. It's just easier, right? I'll buy the tool and there's this add-on and they'll buy that add-on because they don't have to worry about staffing it. That happens a lot in traditional enterprises where they'll roll out a tool and maybe not have the support they need or want to buy additional support. And so we kind of came in as that backstop to be looking for the most sensitive and important detections and information to get in front of customers immediately. And it paid dividends time and time again, right? The product was phenomenal as they're the industry leader now, but it grew over time. And honestly, we started out when Carbon Black was already around and it didn't take long for us to start eating their lunch. And I think Overwatch played a role in that because we had the visibility, we had the capabilities, the tool was phenomenal. We were great operators in the space and we were given actually the time and space to think outside of the box. We weren't given a lot of direction on you have to do it this way. So we kind of didn't follow traditional SOC mentalities. We never even called ourselves a SOC because we were not triaging every single alert. We were not looking at every single thing that came in. We had very specific techniques, things that we were interested in, and we abstracted it at such a level. We could do it at scale very, very easily. It was very interesting times. I would say it took 4 to 5 years for competition to catch up there. And I would say even today, they probably haven't. Overwatch is still probably one of the number one threat hunting teams.
It's super interesting to me. So I assume that you were predominantly working with really early teams. Is that a correct assumption? Or really was it any size team, any type of company, any type of maturity?
I would say they were all over the place. We had some smaller, I won't say small businesses, but smaller customers because they were looking at it from I need an AV. We were a next gen AV provider. EDR was kind of the grab all in addition to it. Before they separated them out into 2 different SKUs on the product, it was well, we did both, right? And then as the product matured, they could, split those out into 2 different products. So we would have customers being like, oh, I need to replace Semantic. I need to replace, McAfee. McAfee had EPO, which was a pretty good tool, but it didn't do all the same things, right? And so they would be looking at the capabilities that we could bring to the table and be like, oh, well, that's a lot easier to run and use and then they would just replace their traditional AV, or in some cases they would run side by side. So environments would test it out because EDR was a relatively new thing. And so they might run both of them simultaneously, and we would see things bypass the traditional AV and then be picked up by EDR behavioral detections.
And I want to hone in a little bit more of what you said earlier. You said that we never followed traditional SOC mentalities and we had very specific techniques and abstractions. Can you talk a little bit about some of the mentality that you had and just go a little bit deeper there? And like, I think it's really curious, really interesting, because I think a lot of people could learn from that.
Probably the easiest thing to abstract on when you're just talking about EDR is parent-child relationships, the ancestry, but not just parent-child, but grandparent. So if you think about how, and I'll just use Windows as an example because it's the easiest one to beat up on, and applies to most, but this abstracts to depending on the operating system in the same manner, right? The grandparent of a process. So command's going to be executed anytime they're going to run like a recon or a roll-bins command. Let me see net use. What are they, what drives am I connected to? Those kinds of commands. But that command spawning net, that parent-child relationship is very, very common. Login scripts way back in the day did it all the time. So I need to look at the grandparent. So what spawned that command? Well, if it came from Explorer, it's on the desktop, somebody double-clicked on it. That's not really, someone's on that system sitting in front of it physically. It's easy to just kind of ignore those. So looking at the parent-child relationship would be like, oh, this came out of an unknown executable. This came out of, W3, WP, or, your IIS process or Apache. Then you're like, well, that shouldn't be spawning a command prompt, which is then running recon commands like, doing a who or who am I on Unix or Linux or, on OS X, finding those kinds of processes and working your way back. Adversaries, when they compromise a box, no matter where it is in an environment, first thing is persistence. I got in. How do I stay here? So they're going to go for passwords or installing a backdoor. They're going to want to know what credentials they got to begin with. Oh, I got UID 0. Cool. Like I'm root now, but they're going to, in order to find that out, they may run who am I, whatever it is for that applicable operating system after they've compromised the host, and just leveraging those kinds of techniques and looking for those simple things. You can start building a trail of breadcrumbs to start feeding other things that you may detect more microscopically. So in environments with developers, it can be a little noisy for some commands, but when you bring in the grandparent, it's a lot easier to be like, oh, that belongs here because it was Explorer, but Java spawning a command execution in any environment or shell would be like, well, that's weird. What is that shell doing? That will then lead you through the path of, okay, that's not normal. Statistical analysis applied to any of those will start eliminating just a metric ton of false positives because you'll have a unique or distinct count and go, aha, this one happened 5 times. This one happened 5,000. 5,000, probably not important. 5? I can go look at those.
I'm really curious, what similarities exist across customers? Like, are people fairly uniform or is everyone kind of a special snowflake?
Having that much visibility in any environment, or even an environment that has, I'll say hundreds of thousands of users because they're out there and I've worked with them. You can come up with the world's best detection and think, this is perfect. This never happens. Really simple thing. I was working with a customer one time and they were like, oh, we never have, a productivity application, Word document, whatever, that would spawn a command prompt and run commands. That doesn't exist. I hear what you're saying, but the data says differently. It happened like 5,000 times a day. And they're like, wait, what? They're like, yeah, it looks like a business process. You guys actually do this. They're like, wow. So, there are snowflake moments. And when you start looking at things at such large scale, you can write it and be like, this is perfect. And it'll blow up when you onboard a new customer or a new business process starts. Maybe it's a new build process. So all of a sudden, these tools or techniques you were detecting on kind of fall apart. And then you have to go through, whitelisting processes or users or specific areas and be like, okay, this doesn't apply over there, but, you can usually tune it to get it to a certain point. But yeah, starting out broad can be great, but it can also be noisy. Like you just onboard a new one and it all goes to hell. So
you were predominantly focused on the logs you were getting from the CrowdStrike agent.
Yeah. So everything that CrowdStrike's agent delivered would be what we would use and leverage.
Yeah. And by the way, your point earlier about how IR used to take a lot longer, fully agree with that. I used to have to dump memory from systems and analyze it, and it would take a while depending on how big the memory was. And then sometimes it's fragmented and it's not complete. So I think I still remember when CrowdStrike came out, it was pretty interesting. And it was actually around the same time that I think OS Query was also becoming more popular. And it was just this idea of like extending what was built into systems. So I fully agree. It was definitely a massive, massive step function improvement on the ability to do incident response. The question I have in my head is, what other data sources were you using to do this analysis? Because I imagine that you can be informed from a lot of different other places. So what else were you doing to make the accuracy higher?
So for Overwatch, a lot of it would be statistical, right? Starting off with a base, and you could narrow it down from there. Because like I said, if it happens 5,000 times in an environment, chances are it's, not always, I will say, but chances are, it's a false positive. If it happens 5 times, then, that's something you can look at. Maybe popularized least frequency of occurrence, LFO, right? And that still holds true today. It's something that they talked about and published. You could use it for almost any artifact when you wanted to narrow in, like as an organization, just be like, oh, what registry keys are we writing to and what software is doing it? Those are really simple things, because if you start looking at the processes across an enterprise environment, if you're collecting that data and then go, this process is only on 5 machines. Well, that's weird. One, is there an approval for it? Internal processes can take over there. Jim in engineering is running this really weird named thing that no one else has. Is there a ticket open for that? Did he get, if they don't have administrative privileges, who approved the installation of the software? What else does it do? What is it accessing? What files is it writing? Tracing it back to its origin. Oh, gee, Jim downloaded it using Internet Explorer because that's where the file events are from. That was what the parent was like. Okay. So he downloaded it from the internet randomly. Then you can go back through and start looking at your other logs. I will say endpoint in general tended to me be an 80% solution, right? A lot of environments they're not going to collect DNS. It's too voluminous. They're not going to connect web logs. It's too much, right? So you'll get a little bit of all those, but with the relevancy. So as an analyst, when I was growing up, I started off doing network forensics. That was the best that we had in the commercial world, right? Then SANS developed the curriculum for being able to do disk forensics and kind of grow and learn how to do some registry forensics and work on that aspect, more traditional dead box stuff. And then memory came along. So it was like I had these pieces and tools. Every time I had network telemetry, I'd be like, well, I know that these things took place on that workstation, or these commands were sent. I don't know what they did. Well, if I had a dead box investigation, I might be able to find out what processes or what files were written around that time. I may not have process information, but so I'm piecing together multiple artifact constellations of information. Like, okay, I got to go do this and run these processes. That takes time. Then I got to go do this and that takes time. You're just getting it all wrapped up in a nice little bow, tied together with all the context. And that was really the key, is the context. Who did what, when, where, why, and how. As analysts, it's like we're playing the game of Clue sometimes. It's like, oh, Colonel Mustard in the library with a candlestick.
I say that all the time. The 5, you ask the who, what, where, why, how. Like, that's so important. And a lot of what we do as analysts is kind of like going to court, right? You have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that this thing happened. It's very gray. It's never black and white. And it's exactly what you said. It's like, oh, well, this one employee was doing this one thing. Why were they doing that? And then you have to like trace back and tell the story, sometimes without going to them, because sometimes you can't go to them, especially if it's like insider threat. It's super challenging. I'm really curious about how you scale this. There's massive amounts of data that are being collected by CrowdStrike and others. And what was effective for making sure your analysts were being effective and really adjusting to that scale as the company grew really rapidly?
Yeah. It all comes down to, time scales, right? A great example of is the classic adversary technique of landing and expanding, right? They compromise one machine and they may hit 10 others in 20 minutes. And each one has a unique C2 and a unique piece of malware, a unique persistence mechanism, because they already have it all planned out and they're ready. They're running off of playbooks, right? This isn't their first rodeo, but the person on the other end, the company receiving that gift, may be their first time. And that's where having, those sorts of operations. But it's always been, how fast can I access the data or information, right? Like, We never measured, and I still today don't like to measure queries in minutes. It has to be in seconds. That's when time counts, because that land and expand. And if you're thinking about incidents and you can't keep track of all those moving pieces or go back and find them quickly, it's like, oh, go pull those 20 machines offline. That impacts the business. That impacts, our ability to execute and remediate quickly. That impacts so much from a business perspective. You'd be like, oh, well, we know what they did. Not something I often recommend, but you'd be like, oh, we could roll it back. Like remove the registry key, block the C2s, and leave the machines online, right? That's a business decision that somebody has to accept the risk to do. But it always comes down to time scale. Like how quickly can I access the data and information I need to answer the questions I have to protect my organization? So it was always like, and even today, it's a, seconds kind of question. Okay. How many machines does this process exist on? I need to know now, I came from the days of ArcSight, right? Where it was to run a report was 20 minutes and it would often crash, and we only had like 4 terabytes of data. That's where I cut my teeth in the SIM world very, very early on. Today it's like, oh, we have petabytes of data. I can get an answer in 3 seconds. And that's searching all that data. That's important, especially at scale. When you're especially if you are in active target. Organizations may not view it that way and, will pick and choose their tools based on financial capability and budget. But that scalability of those tools kind of plays into maybe an unmeasurable expense. How much am I going to have to spend in response? Well, if you can contain it fast, maybe not nearly as much as if you have to go to dead box forensics. You don't have that visibility. You don't have all the answers. You got to pull all those machines offline and, you're impacting the business that way.
How much automation was there in that response?
So we had custom systems, and I still believe in a lot of, the industry has figured out our tooling, from a search perspective, I'll say. From that point on, depending on your workflows, I fully believe in the sockless approaches it's been called, right? If a human does the same thing 10 times, it should be automated. It should be enriched. It should be done before you even hand it to somebody like, hey, what do you think about this thing here? Right? Pointing to an alert. That alert should have all the data and information that may be relevant to it. ASNs, maybe it's the VT information. Maybe it's a URL scan information, oh, here's what that phishing link looks like. And you're like, oh, that looks bad. That saves time and that creates efficiency. And that's, not to make our analysts push button monkeys, but that gives them the opportunity to well, I'd always do these things. Each analyst may have a slightly different flavor. Like, oh, I don't use URL scan. I use so-and-so. Oh, I don't like DT. I use, passive total alert. They have their tools of preference. In the end, they're doing the same thing. They're enriching the information to have more context to make a better decision. The sooner they have that data and information, the faster they can do it. And just be like, click, 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 done. Or even automate the closure of a case by having, this alert came in, it was enriched in this way, followed up with another search to go look up those IPs or those net ranges or that user and their activity. There are playbooks that you can automate where you can really reduce or limit the amount of work that a human has to take the cognitive load to answer.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I love that phrase of if you do it 10 times manually, automate it. Huge fan of that. Does that mean that your analysts were developers or I use it in air quotes, right? It's like they knew enough to be dangerous, or did you sort of split the team and have some developers that were actual software engineers sort of complement the analysts who were hardcore security people could look at logs and be like, yes, that's your breach?
That's an awesome question. So in the beginning, it was very, very small. People to this day, I assume if all held true, it still is smaller than most people could ever imagine because of the ability to, one, maximize and utilize the tooling to its fullest. When we started off, it was actually a couple of people who were good at development and developed custom tools. Cause of course, in those kinds of environments and in any environment, right? You may have bespoke customization, a business tool internally, that you only know the APIs for. And so you're going to use that to do user lookups or something random. So we had to build our own tooling. So we had some developers who were cyber savvy, I'll say. They weren't historical, traditional, full on, I'm just a software dev. We brought on some of those later on. as our tooling and our reliance on said tooling grew and grew and grew, because it started to be used internally a lot more by not just my team, but by other teams. And then, we had analysts, I had a research cell, and we had a developer cell. So we kind of then, as most organizations will do, they start off small and you have a bunch of, jack of all trades. Oh, I can write some simple Python code that's really scrappy to get this thing done so I don't have to do it 10 times. Like it happens, I push some buttons. And as a result of that, and that effort and work, like I have analysts who actually own patents on some of the work that the Overwatch team did because they contributed significantly to the way we work, the thought processes behind things, which is pretty awesome to say like, oh, I was a cybersecurity analyst and I have a patent. Like, what? That's awesome. So yeah, it's taken a lot of really great things as time went on.
It's always really interesting to combine various backgrounds of people as well. And especially in security and especially at scale, you have to learn, in my opinion, 3 concentrations of knowledge. There's security, obviously, baseline, understanding how attacks work, the kill chain, some of the things you mentioned, like, okay, attackers, when they come in, they're going for persistence, like how they think and behave. So there's that. And then there's some form of development, right? Like various waves of it. It could be simple bash scripting, whatever, Python scripting, or it could be actual development. And then I think the third one is kind of like I'd put it under an umbrella of like systems administration / DevOps, and understanding like how systems work and how to manage a lot of systems. Because one, you need to know how systems work to do forensics, because you're looking effectively at a timeline of events. You're like, okay, well, this is normal. And you're sort of like kind of being the machine learning model. You're like, that looks weird. That's abnormal, because I know how my thing works. And then when it comes to deployment at scale, it's, can I take this agent and deploy it to 100,000 machines? And it's a very different mindset from being a developer, which is a very different mindset from being a security analyst. So when you put people in this multifunctional, like cross-functional group, I think all of those things sort of, they complement each other, and people learn from, the other side of the table, like, okay, this is how I need to be thinking about security. This is how I need to be thinking about DevOps. Like, creates a really cool dynamic. And like, I've seen that play out a few times where I learned a lot from sitting with certain teams and having cross-functional teams. So I love that approach. I think it's super effective.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm a strong believer, it doesn't apply to everybody. Like I couldn't script my way out of a paper bag, but I think as you grow as an analyst, you kind of need to start being able to rely on some of those skills, like learning a little bit of Python or something, because you can automate yourself out of a job, or you make your job that much more enjoyable because you free up time with repetitive tasks to go do more cool exploratory work go into, if your environment doesn't support it or doesn't have a dedicated team, to do more threat hunting, to spend more time with the data, thinking outside of the box, not being driven by the day-to-day kind of overrun of information and kind of things that you need to do. And to the other point that you made, we would have our development team in bed with our analysts to see exactly how they use the tools and to get their, like, you're doing what? Why would you do this, and this? That doesn't make sense. Like, I can make that really easy for you. And then they would get excited because they were developing products for a team where they could see the value and the benefits, and improve it and enrich it, and also get a little bit of insight into how they would work. Because while no 2 analysts work the same, for the most part, they all kind of followed a similar path at some point in time. And that was very beneficial to have a tight coupling to our development team and our research team, where, they would all kind of talk together and work on projects across those lines occasionally, which made it a lot better for everybody and just continue to grow.
I can vouch. I mean, that's effectively how I learned. I started as an analyst, and then there was this one guy that I hope he joins the podcast one day. I think he's super smart and he's done incredible work, like super high scale networking and really, really good security. And I would just sit at his desk and he would just explain how his Nessus scanners were set up, and how he had set up Bro and Suricata. It was called Bro at the time. It's called Zeek now, obviously.
Yep.
And those experiences are so valuable for security people, because, the next thing I want to ask you is what are good resources and good communities that you think people can hang out in to really get some of this diverse school of thought?
having worked in many different enterprises, some of them have the old graybeard in the corner, like who just has been there for 20 years and knows everything and has touched everything. And, people kind of leave him alone. He might be a little grumpy or grouchy at times too, but all your systems may be unique. And that was one of the things, that I think analysts, come to realize after, like, oh, they go through school or maybe they're going through a boot camp and learning about, very specific SOC things or cybersecurity things. Then you get dropped into an environment and you're like, wow, they didn't tell us about AS400s. Like, you guys still run that? What does that look like? You'll learn your environment around you. And that's almost as important as knowing about phishing and EDR programs and tools, because your snowflake of an environment, that's typically where your crown jewels are stored, right? If you start thinking about businesses and organizations, been around 30 or 40 years, not the 10, 15, 20-year tech companies, right? They probably have bespoke systems. But like those more traditional environments, they have systems that contain data and information. Maybe it's a warehousing program. Maybe it's a research, academic research category tool, or, it's something specific to that business that only they have, that they probably wrote from scratch internally, that has a lot of very sensitive, valuable information. And 9 times out of 10, nobody's paying attention to them. It was written by somebody 30 years ago and hasn't been touched, or there's only 2 people that support it. So you're going to need to develop those relationships internally with other teams. And also, quite frankly, some of that internal work is the first time you want to talk to somebody as a security analyst or as a security leader, you don't want to be when there's an incident and be like, hey, Jim, yeah, those systems you got running out on the internet? We got to talk about those because we're shutting them down. Like, those aren't the times you want to build those relationships. So internally is always great because you need to learn your environment. It's kind of knowing what you're in charge of and what you're protecting, because then you can start to think more like, hey, okay, we process financial transactions. How do we do that? What is here? Oh, we process payments. Where do they go? How does that workflow look like? What are our exposures? Whatever that is. As far as a community, when you're an analyst, sometimes going to training or doing networking helps. And honestly, I was horrible at that early on in my career. And when I started to do it was when I got into defense, because there were information sharing groups. Those were really good. I built relationships there that I still maintain today. And now I have this network of people who are all over the place in terms of industry, capability, and if I have a funky, weird question, I can go through my Rolodex. I can just be like, hey, Sean, I know you're the Russian adversary guy. Like, I haven't had to deal with him in a while. I'm dealing with something kind of funny, or have you seen this or have you heard this? And you'll develop that nice little network where sometimes it'll be like a wink and a nod, like, yep, haven't seen that one yet, because you can't share that information because it's, sensitive to your organization. But you can at least put your feelers out or be like, what is working for you to detect things in your environment at scale? What are you using for phishing? Man, we're having a lot of trouble with, X, Y, and Z tool. Have you run into this before? Because sometimes those decisions don't come easily. So as an upcoming analyst, definitely trying to go to B-sides are great. There's a couple of really good ones. SANS training is very expensive. And if you're entering the industry, can be difficult, but it also can be extraordinarily beneficial. Even if you just go to some of their conferences, they're really good. I like to look at a lot of tools and things that are developed. Like, I came across the tool that you had worked on before it became Panther. And I read about it. I was like, oh, that's pretty awesome, and doing research. And I follow a lot of people on Twitter because you just learn so much there. It can be an engaging community at times, but if anything, it gives you points and places and time to go look at things as an analyst and ask questions and be like, so-and-so was talking about this QuakeBot thing. Have we seen that? What would that even look like in my environment? And sometimes you might be able to reach out to that researcher or, support like that to kind of start growing your network and figuring out things on your own. Because at heart, a lot of us really dig what we do and want to be able to talk about it and share what we can when we can.
Which is tricky given the sensitivity of our work.
Exactly. So it may just be like, wink and a nod, like, yeah, you should really go look for this IP address. I don't know why, but it's kind of important.
Yeah, here's a list of 10 IPs that we may or may not have seen do certain things.
Yeah.
It's funny. That's always been a challenge, though, to be honest. Just having a good community of sharing, it's very difficult to come across, at least in my experience. Like, some people are very stingy about sharing anything and don't want to talk at all. And then there's other people who are more willing. And there's like ISAC groups, right? Like there's a handful of those I've been a part of as well. And like super, super valuable.
I've had trouble sharing internally even, right? Like, especially within threat intelligence, those groups and working groups, and even, within my own business units, sometimes it's if they come from a more traditional government background, it's very like need to know. And that's just what's been beaten in their head. And you'd be like, hey, I found this thing. What do you think? What do you know? There's like, they take it and they run away. You're like, no. I wanted to have an exchange. You'd be like, nope, sorry, thanks, bye.
Well, it's interesting you brought up StreamAlert, my prior project, because that was actually a good example of something we shared very early. So there was a few sort of like closed door groups we were a part of in Silicon Valley, and just like other Silicon Valley tech companies. And we presented that work to that group fairly early. And we heard similar presentations too, like before eBPF was big, like people were talking about it there, and then StreamAlert and things like that. So it was a really useful group. And I remember there was like a really cool presentation someone gave about like their honeypot that they had built, and they made it seem like they got popped really bad. And they were like, actually, the attacker was in the honeypot. It was so funny. And then they were like, this is the thing we built. It's super cool. Going back to what we were saying before, like the people you surround yourself with really helps inspire your own skill sets, but also your own way of thinking. And that ultimately makes us all better. If you're willing to change, of course, you have to be willing to change.
Oh, absolutely.
But I think that's been something that's been really interesting with security, especially just given how gray it is, right? It's like there's no right or wrong. There's your approach and then there's my approach, and they might both be right. They might both be wrong too. You never know. I've really enjoyed this conversation, Chris. It's been great chatting with you. I feel like I could just have this conversation for the next hour, but obviously we both have our jobs to go back to.
Yeah, absolutely.
But you have such a wealth of knowledge and experience, and I appreciate you taking the time. I want to get one more question in, which is, what 3 pieces of advice do you have for people building or aspiring to build highly performing detection and response teams?
Oh, yeah. So we actually touched on a little bit of that one. You're going to need when you're building those organizations, it's great to have, jack of all trades people, because they'll probably want to specialize at some point, but it helps the detection and response space is, like multiple specific domains all thrown under one umbrella, right? Oh, it's incident response. Oh, it's detection engineering. Oh, it's security operations. Oh, it's threat intelligence. Like there's a lot that you can put in there. And as you mature as a analyst or an individual in our space, you'll touch on a lot of those at some point in time, right? So having those people who know a lot about, or a little bit about a lot of different of those areas can at least start getting you started. Then they can feed the machine, similar to then start building out or specializing, bringing in others to fill the gaps or to grow other parts of it as the business suffers in certain areas, right? Maybe it's like, oh, we need more analysts because we have really good detections and apparently we're very well targeted. So the business can continue to grow and add there. That's one thing I always say, like, and this is more from, don't chase the new shiny. Like our industry is great with buzzwords and changing terms, and like focus on your foundations and basics. That's a big one. And a lot of organizations fail at that. And it can be because you have to manage upwards, right? Your leadership is reading in the news about this new thing that's happened or this new technology. Hey, do we have that? And, maybe they're getting pushed to be, you should buy this thing, right? We need this tool. My buddy's running it over at so-and-so organization. Those kinds of conversations can happen. And so, focusing on the foundations and not getting distracted easily, because honestly, the foundation that you lay is what you'll stand on. And if it's weak and shaky, you'll continue to, drop the ball. You'll continue to have incidents. You'll continue to have, operational issues or problems. And so making sure that you start well and strong first is like way important. That could mean many different things. It may be having just the right couple of tools, making sure all your data is parsed properly. Like it means a lot of different things to different organizations depending on where you start. And the other thing that I think we tend to over index on or overdo is we want to capture all the telemetry and all the data and information. And I say, if you can't search it, don't store it. And most organizations are like, oh, we have to keep this for 3 years, but we have no way to search it past, 90 days or something like that. And they don't think about the implications there and how to do it operationally. And that's a problem. And I mean, it's a good problem to have that you can store data, but if you can't search it, why are you holding on to it, right? Or if it's too big of an ask. That's probably the big one.
Really great pieces of advice, very inspiring pieces of advice as well. So I appreciate that. Chris, thanks so much for the time. It's great to have you on the show, and good luck with everything.
Yeah, thanks a lot.